Mike Polek, who I've known for over 25 years. Very kind, and I've worked with him as well. I've been his client. So I'm excited to have him here with us and introduce him to you. Very intuitive, healing person in my life and other people's lives. So I highly recommend reaching out to Mike Pollock for coaching, for grief, forgiveness, and energy healing. When I was diagnosed with cancer, just showed up and gave me energy healing and helped me balance my energy and my chakras. And we had a nice discussion. It was really supportive just before I started my chemo and radiation. So thank you for that, Michael. So Mike Jackson Pollock is an author, workshop facilitator, life coach, and grief coach. He holds master's degree in computer science and spiritual psychology, as well as a certificate in consciousness, health, and healing from University of Santa Monica. He's a minister in the Church of the Movement of Spiritual Inner Awareness. Mike has facilitated workshops in California, Kansas, Maryland, and online. He is currently working on his second edition of his book, Healing Through Grief, Finding Freedom from Depression, to include new chapters on fear, romantic obsession, and suicide. He is delighted to be sharing his work with you today. I also want to say I read his book about 5 times, and it really helped me get through grieving the loss of my sister and uncle and my fur baby. Please welcome Mike Jackson Pollock.
Thank you, Hadia. That was a lovely introduction. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. As Hadia said, I'm delighted to be able to share my work with you. And my intention really is that everyone receive value from this little talk. Also, I'll let you know to set things up that when I give talks, I tend, especially in a group this size, I tend to be a little more interactive. So there might be times when I ask a question and I actually expect an answer. So I believe everybody is able to unmute, so I might actually wait for a couple people to pipe up and say something like little popcorn. Because I think it's sometimes helpful to have other people speaking and other energy in the room. So usually I'll just be asking for little short answers to things, but it's also about attuning to people's current understandings and things like that. In the work that I do, some of it's about coming up and redefining the way we look at grief and depression and all those things. So without further ado, I'm going to see if it's possible to share my screen. And if that worked correctly, you should now see a nice little screen that says welcome. Excellent. And if you have that, if you've got, there should be a little slider that you can actually, if you want to see more of me, you can slide to the left and make the screen small. And if you want to see more of the screen so you can read it, you can make that bigger. And you can do that adjustment on your screen if you like. So the purpose of this talk is to present information about the nature of grief and how it relates to depression. We're going to talk about how these things are related in consciousness. And the intention is to provide keys to working with the grieving process, to work with awareness, to move through that process with grace. And earlier, as we were, in the morning session, I heard the words grief and depression and fear a few times. So I think I'm in the right place. Yeah. So basically this talk is we're going to talk about what is grief, what's the nature of loss, what is depression, and how are they interrelated, right? These are the things we're going to be moving forward with. So this will be my first opportunity to sort of ask a question. When I say, what is grief? What do we think of when I say grief? What does the word mean to people? And I'm opening that up for a little bit of just a little snippet of a question. And if you talk over each other, it's okay. We'll sort it out.
How it
Anybody, what is grief?
feels when you lose something.
When you lose something. Yep.
How it
Anyone
feels
else?
when you lose something.
Mm-hmm.
Grief for me is missing someone.
Mm-hmm. Right. How it feels when you lose something, missing someone.
I would say sadness.
Yep. Very good.
Yeah, the sadness of losing something very dear to
Yes.
one.
Yeah. Okay. So, and the key to the key part is in the first person had it is that grief is the emotion that shows up paired with a loss. But the question then becomes, well, okay, what is loss? So that's the next question. What is loss? When I say, well, something, when you're missing something, what is a loss? What does that mean? What does it mean to lose something?
And you can't be with that person anymore, or you can't reach that thing anymore.
Hmm.
It's outside of my reach physically.
The
It feels
fear of of the unknown. Sorry.
fine. The fear of, I mean, I feel out of balance and disoriented and in a fog and or whiteout actually. Have you ever been in a whiteout in a storm? That's what it feels like to me. It's a complete whiteout. I just can't see beyond the end of my nose or even to my nose.
It's also it's also uh, it's also a sense of lack of control. One has Without control, one does not know what's happening in life because there's such a change in life, and how is one going to deal with it?
I would say that when my wife lost her sister to an accident suddenly 3 years ago, she lost part of herself.
Hmm.
I mean, quite literally lost part of herself. It was like it wasn't a twinning necessarily, but they spoke very frequently. And when the sister was no longer there, there was a big hole left.
Hmm.
And she couldn't summon that from anything else. There was no other person that could fill that void.
I think
Yeah.
it has to do with our identity as well, of part of ourselves, of how we see ourselves in the world, and then suddenly a, a piece is missing.
Yeah. Sometimes identity can, or sometimes loss can involve identity. That's true.
Missed opportunities.
Hmm. But operationally speaking, like what do we like when we say I've experienced a loss? What is that? What is that experience? What's the nature of the experience on a more like on a real fundamental level? Because the things I've heard have talked about the consequence of when I experience a loss, this is what happens. But what is the loss itself?
Well, I
How's,
lost my child to SIDS, my son to SIDS. I mean, he died. So,
hmm.
that's like in my opinion, the worst, the loss of a child.
Hmm.
I mean the birthing process that the woman goes through and go through all that, and then just to have him removed so instantly is quite devastating.
Hmm.
Fear of the unknown, which kind of piggybacks on what was said about the loss of identity. It's like, who am I now facing this? What's left of me? It feels like an amputation.
Mm, yeah.
Yeah, I would say an emptiness,
Hmm.
just an emptiness of something you would do normally is not there anymore. Like a whole part of life is not there.
Yeah.
Well,
So
A
I'm going to
threat,
go with,
can I say something?
yeah, go
Also
ahead.
a threat of to one's survival.
Uh, Okay, so let's tease that out a little bit. So I like Michael's what he said, something that is not there anymore. Something that would be a threat to survival, that's going to be, we'll talk about that later. Um, that's not necessarily what I would operationally call the nature of loss, but that certainly falls under the fear aspect, and we'll get to that. Um, but if we look at loss as just operationally speaking in consciousness, something that was there isn't there anymore, whether it be the loss of a loved one, the loss of a child, right? It's like something that was here in my life that was present and it's no longer present. So just operationally in consciousness, that's what loss is. If I lost something, it's here and it's not there anymore. So, and earlier we talked about that, the natural response to that, the emotion that shows up when I experience a loss is grief, right? That's what we call it. That's the label that we give to that emotion that shows up. And another way and grief shows up as sadness, as a dark feeling, as it's a negative emotion. So now what we want to look at is what's the relationship with depression? And now if I ask what is depression, what would you say? And again, I'm opening it up a little bit because I also heard a number of people use that word depression when they were talking about recent events. What do we mean when we say depression?
Chronic sadness,
Chronic sadness. Okay.
extended period.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I lose my ability to function, kind
Mm-hmm.
of turn into a, fetus position.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say the same. My inability to move forward or move into my life the way I normally had been.
A heaviness,
Being,
the weight of the
being,
world on my shoulders.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Paralysis.
Great.
yeah, being stagnant in your consciousness, your thought.
Mm-hmm.
And then I want to add, and I'm a lifelong Christian Scientist, and Mrs. Eddy introduced the idea that loss is gain, actually, because, everything is, which is just an interesting thought that I've always been raised on and grateful for. Just wanted to share it.
Thank you.
Mm.
Paralyzed in sadness.
Paralyzed in sadness. Mm-hmm. Now, some of what I heard was some of the consequences, like when I'm depressed, then I can be paralyzed. When I'm depressed, then I'm curled up and I'm unable to move. But when we talk about the nature of depression, so in what they call the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, right, the DSM of in psychology, they talk about, if someone is there's signs and symptoms of depression, and it's all the things we talked about, the sadness, you can tell, it's like, how can you tell if someone's depressed? You don't see someone go, I'm depressed. Doesn't happen that way, right? Somebody goes, yeah, I'm depressed. Then you get it, right? Because it shows up in the body. It's the way that the emotion shows up and someone experiences it. And that's not to say that you can't hide it. People hide it all the time. But generally speaking, when you are expressing the emotion, you can see what that is. So those signs and symptoms, an interesting thing is that in that diagnostic and statistical manual, the signs and symptoms of grief and depression are essentially identical. And what happened was they said, well, look, here's the signs and symptoms of depression, but we have an exception for you, right? If you're in a state of bereavement, right? If you are grieving something, whether it's the loss of a loved one or a job or something like that, then we have this exception. We label it grief, and we won't diagnose you with depression just yet. And if it goes on for long enough, say a year, then we'll go ahead and we'll attempt to treat you for a depression. So my tenet here is that really what happens is when I experience a loss, the emotional follow-up to that is in fact depression. We just call it grief because we know what the loss is. If enough time passes, right? We say, well, it's not grief anymore. Now you're in depression. But the signs and symptoms are identical. Okay, why is this important? Because what we want to do is we want to start looking at operationally in consciousness, how this operates and what's really going on underneath all of this. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, right? How do we operate in consciousness, right? And this is almost like I'm giving away too much information. Right now, there's only the present moment of now. Guess what? We're all in now, right now. That's the only place that we actually ever can be is in the now. That's the place where we have all of our conversations. That's the only point of existence. However, we relate in consciousness to things like the past and the future as though they were real. And how do we relate to the past? Hint, it's on the slide. This is your opportunity.
Memory.
Slam dunk. Right. Wow, that's amazing. Yes. Good answer. Good answer. Right? Our past is our memories. That's how we relate to it. Right? And our future? Hint, it's on the slide.
Fantasy.
Right? It's a fantasy, it's a projected future. And for most people, our future that we have planned out is based on our past. Whatever was going on yesterday, it's probably going to go on tomorrow. I have a calendar that tells me what my future is going to look like. Does that make sense?
Can I add something here?
Sure.
I was thinking, I've thought a lot about the past and how we can get stuck. Um, the memory, what are the memories? What is the nature of the memories? Um, and too often, certainly speaking for myself, it can be negative in two ways. It can be regret or resentment, or actually resentment is against myself. That would be regret, and then the future can, be unproductive also if there's fantasies or fears that exist there. So if I spend time in the past or future with those kind of negative uh, connotations, then that doesn't help me. The only way I could be positive is if I have appreciation in the past for what I've had, what I've experienced, and anticipation toward the future in a hopeful, positive way. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about, well, hang on, let me keep moving here for a sec because I don't want to get too caught up in, because we'll have a Q&A later, but just bear with me. So the question now is, right, if this is how we look at ourselves in our timeline, right, we have a past and we have a future, what does loss look like in this framework? Or more to the point, what framework am I going to give you that says what happens when we experience a loss? Well, here's what happens, right? That remember we said it's something that was there isn't there anymore. So at the point at which I experience the loss, right, I have my projected future where whatever that is, whether it's a person, whether it's a job, whether it's a relationship, was in my future. And suddenly, right, someone has passed, I just broke up, I was just fired, and suddenly I have this other future ahead of me where tomorrow morning, instead of getting up and going to work, I'll be getting up and hunting for a job. Operationally in consciousness, what happens is I now have two futures and they are incompatible. Right? One future is the one that has just because of the loss, there's a new future that has been created. But there's also this old future that I had, and we all project into the future. It's natural, it's normal. The sun is coming up tomorrow. I'm pretty sure of that one. And if I'm wrong, it's a different ballgame. So we all plan for our future. We all have that future that's created. But when something sudden happens and I experience a loss, I suddenly have two futures. And in particular, For it to be called a loss, right? Something that's there that isn't there anymore, I can usually consider that something negative. And so what happens is I have a positive future, a positive projected future, or a positive future fantasy that is being compared to my new future that has just been created. The way that consciousness deals with a positive future fantasy is depression. That's the emotion that shows up. And we call it grief when we're really close to the loss and we know what it is. Does that make sense? Give me a thumbs up if you like. That makes sense to me. Thumbs down if you're like, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. All right, Carolyn says, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. And everybody else is unresponsive. I didn't get thumbs ups or thumbs down from most people.
Can you explain it again, please?
Sure.
Thank you.
When I experience a loss, something that's there that wasn't there anymore, and I'll take an example. So the seeds of this work for me started, 25 years ago, and I was in a relationship. And as with most relationships, I had been through a couple of breakups here and there, whatever, we got back together. But there was that one final breakup that was the one where, that's the one. It's like, it's not coming back. And from that point, I was depressed, right? I was lying in bed, crying, sobbing, the whole 9 yards, dysfunctional. Thankfully, it was like on a weekend, so I didn't have to go to work, and I was just an absolute wreck. And this went on for, a few days, right? It went on for a while. And then there was a point, and I just remember it so clearly. I was walking from the kitchen to the bedroom, and I had one thought. Why am I crying over a relationship I say I don't want? I broke up with him. Why am I crying over a relationship that I say I don't want? And in that moment, it was clear to me what I was crying over, what I was grieving, was not the relationship I had. That one was not working. What I was crying over was, if only he had done this. Oh, if only I had been, oh, if only, if only we had just, I was crying over the fantasy relationship, the one that I wanted, the one where I wanted him to be this great. And don't get me wrong, he's a great guy. We're still friends. But that relationship that I had it wasn't working. And part of it too was because I think I had some unrealistic expectations about what it was supposed to be. My positive future fantasy in that, it was, this great, wonderful relationship. But the relationship I had, when that breakup occurred, right, I had this discrepancy in consciousness between, the relationship I wanted and, the relationship I don't have. But the work to be done when that occurs, it's all of the grieving process is about letting go of that old future, letting go of the old fantasy future. Now, in this example, it was easy, right? When I hit that point of why am I crying over a relationship I say I don't want, my mind came up and went just like short circuited. The waterworks stopped. I was done because I was so clear as to what was going on. It's a little more difficult when it's a relationship you do want, like they broke up with me, or someone died, right? It's more difficult, but the process is the same. So hopefully that clarified a little more about what does it mean to have a positive future fantasy and what does it mean to experience that loss. So let me just do a little check here where I'm going. Yes. Okay. So at USM, University of Santa Monica, which I'm sure you have all heard about multiple times, we talk about how you relate to the issue is the issue. And on the slide, you can see some common responses to experiencing a loss. And we talk about people are upset, they're angry, sad, go into bargaining, denial, depression, acceptance. Some people, you may be familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was doing research and she was working with a population of people who had been told that they had a terminal illness. So they were looking at their lives being over sooner than they had expected. And so they were in that process of grieving as well. And she talked about the five common responses or the five stages of uh, depression and loss and grief and whatnot. And do people remember what those state? How many people are familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her work in the five stages? Great. So I want to talk about those just briefly. So if you think about it in this new framework, right, we can talk about what does it mean for these individual things. And the stages, quote stages that she identified were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Those were the ones that she talked about. In our framework, right, let's start with the first one. If you're in denial, what does that mean? Well, what it means is that I'm completely attached to my old future, right? My fantasy, like someone broke up with me, I don't believe it. Or I got the notice that, someone died, and I'm like, I refuse to believe that. It's not true until if you wonder why we go to wakes and hang out with, bodies in caskets, part of that I think is to make it more real and to make sure that we don't go into denial, right? But when I'm in denial, I am fully invested in my old future and I am completely denying that my present reality exists. What does that do? Well, that gap in consciousness, it maintains it. And what's the emotion that goes with that? See, if I'm completely in denial, right, and I'm ignoring the present, I might be able to skip out on some of those negative emotions and the depression for a little while, but eventually the chickens will come home to roost, right? At some point, reality will come in and I will still have these incompatible futures. And the bigger that gap gets, expect the depression to be a bit deeper. Eventually, because my mind will compare those two futures. Bargaining is another response that people have. And just a note that the word stages is now passé, right? Because they're not in any particular order and people don't necessarily experience all of them. It's not that kind of a thing. And I just look at them as common responses when you experience a loss. If I'm entering into bargaining, what am I doing? I'm attempting to make my present reality, right, the new future, look like the old one. And I will do anything I can. Dear God, please take away this new future. Let me have the old one back. And don't get me wrong, it's not a bad strategy. From the mind's perspective, the mind wants to close that gap. And if you could do it by bringing back the old one, get rid of, right? My new future is if I have a positive future fantasy that's holding this whole gap out thing, if I can make my present reality more positive, I would do that. It's not a bad strategy. But most often it doesn't work, right? Especially, for example, if you experience the loss, someone has died, all the bargaining in the world isn't going to change that. But it will, as you're working through it, maintain that gap, right? It's not going to do anything to close the gap, it's just going to maintain it. When enough time has passed and we finally said, well, I'm willing to diagnose that, hey, you're in depression, we have this scenario where, okay, I have accepted that I'm in this current reality, but I refuse to let go of that old idea of how it should be. If I have judgments associated with that, like it really should be that way, and dear God, why did you take this person from me? And I'm upset and whatever, you can go into anger. That's a little actually ancillary. Anger is more driven by love, right? It's driven by caring. But for sure, if I maintain that old future fantasy and say that's really the way it should have been, then I will still maintain the gap, even though I'm like, okay, I understand the person's not here, but they should be here, and I will maintain the gap. A friend of mine I was working with, his mother had passed. Um, a friend of hers had given her some chocolate that she was not supposed to have. She was, had a particular health condition, and she kind of took it on the sly and then ate it anyway, and ended up in the hospital. And when my friend got there, when he arrived at the hospital, he was told that his mother had passed, and he was absolutely distraught. And when I was speaking with him, he was like, she could have lived for another 4 years. And to me, what that meant was, you have another 4 years of living with the depression, right? And 4 years from now, when you decide that she could have died, then you'll let go of that idea that she should still be alive. But until then, you're sort of stuck there. And so I was able to work with him on that. And in that particular case, his real challenge was that when he was younger, when he was a kid, his mother, the boiler room had caught on fire, and his mother had gone and literally crawled on all fours to go and drag him out of wherever he was to save his life. And he had in his mind that it was his job to save his mother's life. And in that time, I just told him, you know what, that wasn't your job. It may have been her job to save you all those years ago. It's not your job to save her, and it's not your responsibility. And in that moment, he just started laughing, and he got it, and he was able to let go and let go of the idea that she should still be alive, and to let her have the dignity of her own choices and her own process. So that's just an example of how that can operate. Now, when you move into acceptance, what that means is you close the gap by releasing the old future. So my friend was able to do that. He was able to let go of the idea that his mother should still be alive and work in present reality where she had passed, and she had passed on her own terms. Once that happens, once you no longer have two futures and you just have one future ahead of you, your new planned fantasy projected future from your past, but you're no longer in that stage of where, oh, I've experienced the loss and I have two futures. That's when you come into acceptance, and that's when the depression lifts. Okay, why is all this important? The key to this, like, I can answer the why and the what, not necessarily the how. That depends. But the important thing is to understand that when I'm in the process of grieving, grieving is the process of letting go of the old fantasy future. Because my inner comparator in my consciousness is constantly on. And in that comparison, that's what creates that negative emotional consequence, right? Grief and depression. It is the consequence of a negative or of a positive future fantasy. Everybody with me so far? Okay, got a few head nods. Great. I also want to so that's a little summary. Because I know we're just looking at the time, there's something else that I wanted to cover. I'm gonna see if I can stop this share.
Are you open for questions at all? Or are you waiting?
Give me one sec. There's one other thing that I sort of want to pop up because it came up a few times, and I'm going to see if I can do a little. Yeah. So I'm writing a new chapter in the book that I have, and I'm just going to you're going to get a sneak preview here. Yeah, except that's okay, great. So some people also brought up fear. That was an emotion that was showing up for people. Fear and grief are sisters. Let's see. Hopefully you're seeing what I'm seeing, and that I'm on a different screen though. And that is that when we are in fear, fear's a little different though. Grief is the consequence, or depression is the consequence of a positive future fantasy. Fear is the consequence of a negative future fantasy. Right? So just look I apologize, there's more here than I want to show you, but on the upper left-hand corner, if you look at the diagram, right? When we have a negative future fantasy, right? And I've heard fear as an acronym: fantasized expectations appearing real, or false evidence appearing real. A negative future fantasy will get you the emotion of fear. So they're related, but they're opposites, if that makes sense. All right, let me come back to where we were. So hopefully I have accomplished my intention, which is to give you some keys as to what the grieving process, the nature of grieving. Obviously, I didn't have time to go into do the deep dive and that kind of thing. But I am open to questions. I do want to hear your questions and what you have to say. So go ahead, Patricia.
Yes, I mentioned before the feeling of threat of survival, because I'm witnessing what a friend of mine is going through. She's 82 years old, and her companion of 65 years just died. And so she totally feels threatened.
Mm-hmm.
Besides,
Yes. Yes. I recently had a friend who's he's about 92 now. And a couple of years ago, his partner of 65, some plus years or whatever, had passed. Um, and that was when I met him. And he was having a real challenge with it. When I talked to him about all of this, and part of it was, you know, all of those things, like for him anyway, it was like when he would pull up in the driveway to an empty house, that was when it would really hit him, right? That his partner was no longer there. Um, it is, it's one of those things where moving from that place of there's this emptiness and the emptiness the emptiness in the house is the emptiness in my soul kind of thing. How you come to close that gap, it's individual for the person and the recognition that, right, if he had the idea that his partner should have lived longer, if he had the idea that his partner's supposed to be in the house, right, that will maintain the gap. The key is coming home and saying, it's like I often like to ask people, do you consider your partner's life as complete or incomplete? If the response comes back incomplete, there's still work to be done because they think that they should still be alive. They think that they still had more to do and those kinds of things. And I then have to work with them. Well, what are you basing that on? When they say complete, no, their life is complete. They did everything they wanted to do, and it's a natural ending. And I'm just working on, right? Then they're just working on letting go of the projected future. And it's usually a little bit easier at that point. The threat to survival piece, that's more related to fear, right? If I feel threatened, that means I have a negative future fantasy rolling at the same time, where because this person's no longer here, I think this other stuff is going to happen, right? How am I going to survive? How am I going to, etc. Oftentimes is what we call a negative future fantasy. It hasn't happened yet, but I'm focused on it. And sometimes you can have both running at the same time. I was working with someone where they had this idea of what they wanted to do with their life, right? Which was this positive future fantasy of like, hey, I want to do all these things. But they also had this fear, right? I live this comfortable life in my home in Redondo Beach, and that would take me to a, country in Africa because I want to be in the Peace Corps. And they're like, I don't want that. And so they had two things, they had fear and depression operating at the same time, and the fear was holding the depression in place. I won't go and do this wonderful idea that I have because I'm afraid of what I'd lose.
So, Mike, we do have a number of questions here, so we'd like to move along.
Please.
Did you wrap up that one?
I hope so.
Your satisfaction? Okay. We have Ruth Brody Sharon, who's got a question here.
Yes, in my understanding of Buddhism, non-attachment is a very important goal. And these emotions that you've described seem to be natural emotions, but in the training, in the Buddhist training, the idea is, as I understand it, that you substitute whatever that feeling is or the goal of not being attached to anything, that everything is transitory, that that uh have you found that people who are Buddhist, if you work with them, have a different way of responding to these situations because of that philosophical idea?
Uh, I can't say that I have experience in particular with working with someone who is a Buddhist and talking about that philosophical thing. What I would say is, so if you are a Buddhist and you have this the ideal of non-attachment, right? In this framework, what that would mean is it would just be like, great, so you can let go of the old fantasy future, which was just the plan for your life, right? Again, sun's coming up tomorrow. We all do that. The question is, how quickly can you let go of it? And even though that's my philosophy, I've heard the saying, some attachments are easier to let go of than others, right? The loss of a child, I don't care if you're Buddhist or not, that one's going to be a little more challenging to let go of, right? It will take time, right? Here, and this is really important, right? The idea isn't to like, oh, you wouldn't want to go, oh, I'm a Buddhist, I can immediately let go of that, right? You have to cry every tear, right? That thing that you created, it is part of your creation and you are responsible for your creation. And part of that responsibility is when you have this gap that occurs, when you have these two futures, when the emotions come up, when you're thinking about the old future, when you're thinking about the discrepancy, and the tears are not bad, they're an opportunity to look at and go, oh, where am I stuck in the past? Where am I placing the past in my future? Where am I looking at this old future fantasy? So don't look at the emotion, even though it's a negative emotion, it's not a bad thing. It just tells you where the work is to be done. It's simply an indicator. But the important thing is to understand, what am I doing when I'm in this place of, oh, this the sadness. It's like, oh, right, because I'm often thinking about the old future. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
That you can change your mindset through devotion to a certain philosophy, whether that actually does work and that people experience uh, less grief, less depression when they have a loss, if they are practicing non-attachment. That
If
possible.
yes, if you are a person who can live in the now, right, in the present moment, see, then it's just a matter of someone died, but that's exactly what was supposed to be happening in the present moment. That's just what happened, right? Because if I have no attachment to the idea that they should still be alive, or I have no attachment to the idea I should have still had a job, or the idea I should still have that relationship. If I have no attachment to that idea, then I can live in the present moment and I live in the acceptance of what is. Well, there's no grief and no depression in that. There's no negative emotional feeling. I'm just in the present.
Okay. Can we move on then to Paul Walker?
Yes, thank you for your thoughts. When I look back, all the great philosophers talk about being in the present, being in the moment, right? And I wrote a poem about that called After Letting Go. And one of the lyrics is, after letting go, I saw this light in the valleys across the desert, full of color and wonder. And all I had to do was let go of my thoughts. I mean, our thoughts about the past are just thoughts. They're not real. They're approximations of reality. Our thoughts about the future are also not real. They're approximations about our desires. We're able to let go of our thoughts and just be in the present moment. We do see the sunrise, we see the colors, we see life as it is, and we allow ourselves to grieve. But one of the things that always impresses me about people in the Middle East, because it's a generalization, but when they have a loss, they scream and cry and moan, and there's this great grief that comes out of them. And so, is that healthy? When you have grief, to really accept it and uh, cry and moan.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the keys is that emotions uh, are when dealing with emotional stuff, some people aren't comfortable with it, but the reality is that emotions need to be expressed.
Mhm.
And then if there's someone, if you can, like if someone's expressing emotionally, where you just listen. They don't need to be fixed. Guys, I'm talking to you. They don't need to be fixed, right? They don't need to be responded to in any particular way, but just listening and being with someone with compassion while they're in those emotional states, that in and of itself is curative, right? To if you are feeling the emotion but you will not express it, right? It's going to come out in some weird way.
Mhm.
Right? If you allow yourself to express it. When my mother died, my siblings when we went to the funeral home were like, "Okay, game face on." And pardon my French, my response was, "Fuck that." And I was like, I didn't care what I looked like. I didn't care what was going on, right? If I was in the sadness and whatever, I would just sit there and be in it. And I often say that's why we go to funeral homes and that's why we do that is to be present with that and to allow it to be. That's part of the process of working through it. That's part of the process of letting go. When I see a body in a coffin, that's part of my process of letting go of the other old projected future. This is the one I'm in now, and this makes it real.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Who is next? Me, I guess. Was there someone else who had a hand up in here? I thought there was. Okay. Um, I was going to comment that my wife has had these grief episodes involving her father and her sister both. Her father died of cancer just after he retired, and her sister was killed in an accident. And she definitely is in grief from them, but I think in both cases she felt the life was taken prematurely. Her father died young. He just died right after he retired, and her sister was killed literally at 70 when she had many years ahead of her. So the prevailing emotion I saw come out of her was not in the sense of grieving, in the conventional sense. What I get from her is anger,
Mhm.
literally anger. I mean, just like when the whole thing comes up about her sister, there is just this palpable sense of anger, bitterness that her life was taken from her, prematurely. And I don't know, how does that fit into your scheme of thinking?
So anger is a different type of emotion. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross also talked about the five basic emotions: anger, fear, love, uh, envy, and grief. Anger is actually born of love,
Yes,
right? You do not get angry about things you don't care about.
yes.
It is an expression of caring, but through judgment, right? Things should not be this way, and I know better, and it shouldn't have happened that way. And when I have that deep caring combined with this judgment of how that's not the way it's supposed to be, the emotion that shows up is anger. To me, anger is a cover-up. I'm not willing to go into the hurt,
Mhm.
right? Because the reality is I'm feeling deeply hurt about the whole thing, but I'm not willing to do that, and so I express it as anger. I express it as fiery emotion, right? But as we know, anger is the hot coal you pick up to throw at someone else. You're the one who gets burned, right? And what that means is then I get to experience anger in my body. So in this framework, it is simply, again, it's not when I'm in anger, I'm not really working on the grief and depression piece of things. I'm expressing a different emotion, right? But when the sadness does show up again, that's where I'm working in the grief area.
Yeah,
But to work with the anger, if you want to release the anger, you have to let go of the judgment, right? When you say like, well, her father died, my mother died like 6 months before she was going to retire,
yeah,
and I could have, right? I mean, she had breast cancer that had metastasized, and I could have gone into if only she had listened to me about, how I think she should have done it and those kinds of things, she would still be, I could have gone there, Or I could have allowed her the dignity of her own process and the way that she worked with her cancer and the way that she did it, and just acknowledged that her life was complete at that point. I was still sad, I was still crying, but knowing what I know, it took about 10 days before I really just kind of let go and surrendered and said, okay, and
I appreciate your insight on that. I think we've reached the end of our time, so I really would like the group to say thank you to a very deeply insightful and wonderful presentation, Mike.
all right.
Very much.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.